Hi, I'm Rebecca Martinez, and today we're making a pumpkin sourdough loaf. To a blender, add 120 grams of pumpkin puree. You can use canned or pumpkin puree you made yourself, 3 medjool dates that have been softened or regular, both work totally fine because we're going to add 100 grams of water, ideally a little warm or hot, cold is fine too. Snap on your blender to make sure that it's nice and closed and blend until completely smooth. You don't want any large dates to be in this mixture because you're going to fold it into your dry ingredients. Add 150 grams of fed sourdough starter or levain to a bowl that you generally make bread in. Add 300 grams of additional water to the mix that we already made. We're going to add extra here and dump in all of your pumpkin puree and date mixture that we just made. This pumpkin puree and date mixture will allow the bread to be slightly sweeter. Of course, you want pumpkin and pumpkin bread, but instead of using sugar, I've chosen to use medjool dates for sweetness. Add 300 grams of all-purpose flour to the wet ingredients, followed by some bread flour. Bread flour always helps with sourdough baking, so I like to add it no matter what. Add 100 grams of that bad boy into the mix, in addition to 100 grams of whole wheat flour for taste and fiber, because that's super delicious, and I just personally love whole wheat flour. Opt for all-purpose if you don't have whole wheat flour, or a little bit of more bread flour, whichever is best. Give it a good mix, making sure that the dough becomes completely hydrated, and you're going to let it autolyse for 15 to 30 minutes. This is a crucial step where the flour absorbs all of the liquid that has been integrated into the dough. At this point, add 12 grams of salt. I use iodized salt, but you can use sea salt. If you use kosher salt, make sure to add a little bit more, and 50 grams of pumpkin seeds, ideally toasted, to the mix. Now this is of course the mixing stage where you add a lot of the additional components of flavor and texture with some wet hands. Use a couple stretch and folds to first integrate the salt and the pumpkin seeds into the mixture, but then we're going to use the pincer method, which is essentially pincing or pinching the dough at various locations and then adding a couple of stretch and folds to reintegrate the gluten and allow for the bread to look more like traditional bread that we're used to seeing. So here it is in regular speed. But because nobody can sit and watch bread being tossed around, I've sped it up a little bit. But this is my traditional go-to method. Use the method that you're most comfortable with when you want to add additional flavors and seeds or textures to your bread. Let it rest for 5 minutes after you've incorporated your seasonings and flavors, and then add a series of 3 to 4 stretch and folds. Stretch and folds are taking the outside edges of the dough and pulling it upwards and then towards the middle, making sure to let the dough rest for 30 minutes in between. Now grabbing a little bit of semolina flour or brown rice flour, you're going to coat a basket to prove the dough in. You can choose to use any basket that you have for this specific bread because we're making a pumpkin shape. I've chosen a boule. Release the dough from the pan that you used and bring the edges towards the center, essentially adding a stretch and fold but outside of the device in which you created the bread. For some reason I can't think of it. Flip it over and use your bench scraper to gently pull in the bread towards you to create tension. This is essential for making any sourdough bread and really any bread in general, but specifically high hydration dough and sourdough. So once it's nice and taut at the top, I like to dust it with some additional semolina flour. You can use brown rice flour instead, just to make sure that it doesn't stick to the basket. This is essential. I don't know, it took me a while to figure this out. I could have watched a YouTube video, but trial through error. Lay it into the wicker basket and let that bad boy prove overnight in the refrigerator. Now day 2, when you're going to prep your bread, make sure to preheat the oven to 425 degrees Fahrenheit with the Dutch oven inside. Ideally a large Dutch oven because this bread will be wider than most. Get some cooking twine because that's the way we're going to shape our bread. Get your bread out of the refrigerator And then you're going to make the pumpkin outline. This takes a total of 4 strands. You're going to use a horizontal strand, a vertical strand, and then 2 strands in between those 2 at the diagonal. So it's going to look like you're creating like 12 individual pieces, but it's only going to take 4 strands in order to do so. Lightly dust with some semolina flour on some parchment paper. Add that on top of your bread that's still in the basket and flip it over so it lands nicely on the strands so you have a good workspace. This is just the method I like to use. Now, tie the strings across one another, ideally the same string you will tie across. You can leave it a little taut or a little tighter. I like a little bit of a tighter fold, and then tie those strings nice and tightly, making sure that they don't, burst or anything. If they're too loose, they will release, and cut off the extra fringe. Now, my favorite part of this bread is to score the bread. Grab a bread lame or a really sharp knife and gently score some leaves onto each individual segment of the pumpkin bread. This is how you do it. This is how I do it, at least. And you want to take one long dash down the middle and then small dashes on the outside, just like when you were a kid making like little stick figure people. Similar here, we're making some leaves in the same method, and it creates this remarkable design on the bread. I love this part. It's probably my favorite part to do because I actually finally am sort of good at making some designs. Now, carefully place the bread into the preheated Dutch oven, making sure not to burn yourself. This is crucial. Add the lid on top, and we're going to bake it for 30 minutes covered in the oven at 425 or 450 degrees for a darker bake, and then 15 minutes uncovered. I like to bake at 450 while it's covered, and then just take the lid off and get a really dark crust. But if this is not your thing, don't worry about it. Do 425 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, to remove the twine, I grabbed a pair of scissors, or you can just use your hands and release the strings by cutting the edges. Mine seem to be inside of the bread. Do not worry, because if your crumb is properly baked, you can just pull those suckers out. No problem. Your bread is totally fine without it. If it's hollow, it's done. If you like this content, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button, and see you next week.